A week ago, I wondered if they were a top 4 team in the NFL, and now I'm wondering if that's too low. This is absurd what they are doing. Putting up 70 points yesterday against Denver, the most points in an NFL game since 1966, 726 yards, the most in an NFL game since 1951. And it is real and it is horrifying. Mike McDaniel, when he took over the job, said to Tua, quote, "Do you not understand the player you are?" McDaniel certainly understood, and he keeps getting better. I honestly think the rest of the NFL has to look at this and go, look, you can knock Denver for the lack of momentum they have, 0-3, the awful Washington loss on top of this. This was actually a decent defense last year, too. If you look at some of the yardage stuff, they were top 10. I don't know what you're supposed to do with this right now. This feels a little bit like the early Oregon days with Chip Kelly. And remember that Oregon-Michigan game where Oregon showed up to Ann Arbor and just put it on them, and they were like, okay, we need to move on quickly. I think Chip was actually the coordinator. He wasn't even the head coach when that game happened. That was like a wake-up call to the Big Ten. It was a wake-up call to Michigan. It was a wake-up call to the rest of the NFL. I don't know if that's necessarily this, because we know in the NFL things have a weird things of balancing themselves out. But whether it's Tua's numbers, who he certainly does not look like a backup now, Russillo, he's got an 83 QBR through 3 weeks. That'd be the highest for a QBR season, which, not know that he's going to stay at that number. That'd be the highest in 5 years. We talked about motion a little bit. I promise I'm not going to do this every single week, but they had a man in motion at the snap 49 times yesterday. They didn't even have Waddle, if you may have forgotten that, by losing track of the inactives if you're not playing fantasy. And Devon Achane, who I loved at A&M, he didn't play week 1 because of the shoulder. He had 1 carry and 1 reception on his stat line for 2023. And he had 18 carries, 203 yards, 2 touchdowns, 4 catches, another 2 touchdowns. It's like not fair that the Dolphins have him on the team on top of Mostert and everything else that they're doing. They didn't even have to play defense. And I mean, this thing was ugly early. It was ugly late. They still scored 21 points in the fourth quarter, and they could have, if they wanted to, gone for the NFL record in points. Oddly enough, the NFL and Vegas and on the road, there's always little reminders that people are like, is this as horrifying as you're making it out to be? Because Vegas has the Bills as a 2.5-point favorite in Buffalo next week for week 4. The best win. Well, it's kind of Miami, but if I can't pick Miami, I'm going to go Chargers. They avoid going 0-3 had they lost at Minnesota. And then Brandon Staley avoiding the all-time, is he going to get fired this week kind of week, by going for it on 4th and 1 at their own 24-yard line with 1:51 left. So I'll admit, if you just go, hey, here's the score, it's a yard, granted you're on your own 24, get the yard, that's what the analytics say. Okay, but I don't feel like my biggest issue with some of the numbers, even though I like them, is it accounting for who you are as a team and who you are that day. They didn't have Eckler. They could not run the football yesterday, okay? On 13 handoffs, so the designed runs, the Chargers had 19 yards. Granted, Herbert did his job, so we talked a little bit about this balance and being too pass-happy, bringing in Kellen Moore, that he was going to balance these things out. We've seen it at times this season, but granted, no Eckler, and then just deciding, hey, this isn't going to make any sense, especially when you looked at what Minnesota was doing blitz-wise. So we can get to the Minnesota blitz numbers here. I will bring those up a little bit later. So if you're 4th and 1 at the 24, are you afraid of punting it to Kirk Cousins and having him go 75, 80 yards for the touchdown? I get the point. You get the yard, the game's over. But you couldn't run the football. So when you're dialing up what the probabilities are you accounting at all for who you are on that day? And I don't think that they were. So I didn't hate the idea of it. I hated it for them because of their struggles. And it's Staley not gotten that. Look out. Now, not to be outdone by miscues late, the Minnesota Vikings, they get the stop, right? They had a bunch of plays from that point on. They get into the red zone after converting a 4th and 5. 23 seconds go off the clock after that 4th down conversion to when they actually run a play. Now, I've heard the explanations, I've listened to it, but from that point on, you're watching it at home going, okay, they're going to clock it. And I don't even love spiking the football in certain chances. Like sometimes I look at that just as a wasted play because you go, well, what if you had just snapped it and then actually throw it into the end zone, give somebody in a one-on-one matchup a chance to jump up for it? Is that actually more valuable than the extra couple seconds? Because by the time you get up there and spike it, if you just ran the play, it depends on how soon you can get set. They couldn't even figure out what the play was going to be. It was that loud in a home stadium, which is probably really frustrating for the Vikings and all that. And this isn't like a Cousins specific thing. I just feel like there's a handful of quarterbacks that would just take over that situation going, we need to clock it. We need to clock it. There's different reports on if you're watching a game, like how bad you want to make it sound. You want to make it sound like they lost 29 seconds. I mean, it felt like forever. You're like, what are they doing? What are they doing? Cousins got his hands over his ears. He's looking back at the sideline. The head coach, O'Connell, took all the blame for it. Cousins is like, I'm not supposed to spike it on my own. Then he was asked, can you spike it on your own? I just can't imagine Aaron Rodgers not at some point going, we're going to do a better job than this. It really felt like 23 seconds. Whatever it was disaster. They throw a pick. The pick wasn't on Cousins. The ball was tipped up in the air, and they lose. The Vikings, 11-0 in one-score games last season, 0-3 this year. I could have gone Green Bay best win. It's the second time ever in the Packers' history, down 17 entering the fourth quarter, they've come back and won a game. It was a great comeback, but with Derek Carr going out, I felt like it wasn't quite the same as what the Chargers did. Just not being – we were sitting here looking at the Chargers going 0-3, like, what is wrong with this football team? I still think I have questions about them at 1-2, so it's not like a huge parade is going to be scheduled anytime here. Worst loss, it's Denver, but if we can't pick Denver, I'm going to go Dallas. Maybe Arizona is actually okay. The O-line, despite the makeshift nature of how they put that group together, they're good. Does Caleb Williams watch games on Sunday going, I didn't want to go to Arizona. I was hinting at that idea, staying at SC if Arizona ends up with the number one pick. I don't know if Arizona is going to end up with the number one pick. Is the O-line good enough that Caleb Williams is like, you know what, sign me up. I'm good. I'll go to Arizona. They ran it for 222 yards on the ground against a front with Dallas, which is considered a strength, which is still a strength. I shouldn't even say it that way because then I'm guilty of things I don't like. Like, hey, I thought their defense was supposed to be good. Dallas defense is probably still going to be pretty good, but for a day. And I don't know if it's teams taking them lightly, whether it's Giants part of this, because when I watched them against the Commanders, I didn't think Arizona was any good. Other than a fumble recovery, quick score there, that team didn't do much offensively. Dobbs came in, 17 days before the season started? And it was like, okay, what are they doing here? Like you're not going to keep Colt McCoy on the roster just to keep him on the roster. Like that's kind of weird. Yet what they're doing on the ground and Dobbs making enough plays and they're missing a couple of their best defensive players. I don't know if it's Dallas completely overlooking them. And the Dak interception stuff last year was fluky. I stand by that. But he's starting to have a tendency for his picks are just monumental mess ups. Like it's getting into some of the Jimmy Garoppolo stuff with his pick in the end zone there. I don't know if that's who he's going to become, but it's one thing to throw a pick every now and then. It's another thing where it's like, hey, that interception now means the game is over. Numbers you should know. Minnesota blitzed 82% of Chargers dropbacks. That's the second highest since ESPN started tracking this in 2006. I don't know if that's a carryover of the next-gen stuff because what Martindale and the Giants defense did against Brock Purdy on the game that we talked about last week, that was considered the highest tracking of blitz percentages that we'd seen since Next Gen did it. So I don't know if Next Gen and ESPN Stats and Info have a different start date on that. It was a lot of blitzes. However, Herbert was 32 of 38, 301 yards, 3 touchdowns is the most completion, most attempts against, and the most yards. So most completions, attempts, and yards against the blitz in an NFL game since 2006. Translation, it didn't work. Another number you should know. How many backup quarterbacks are we on here early? Well, with the Jets, we already know that. Indy, with Richardson out with the concussion. New Orleans, Derek Carr gets knocked out of that game. Jameis comes in. Bryce Young was out with an ankle injury for Carolina, so he saw Andy Dalton throw it 700 times. Cincinnati, Burrow did take first-team snaps, so we don't know if we're going to have a backup situation in Cincinnati, but it's very early on here, and we're already seeing some of the backups. Another win probability update. Fourth quarter at Baltimore. Colts and Ravens in a battle. They decided to put up the win probability next-gen stat on the broadcast when Baltimore had the ball at 3rd and 20. They were trying to set up a Justin Tucker game-winning field goal attempt in regulation. Tucker went on to miss a 61-yarder. But for whatever reason, they thought a next-gen win probability stat giving the Ravens a 51% chance of winning that game was info we all needed at the time. The Colts obviously won in overtime. And finally, the award for the most likely Belichick draft pick is Arizona State's Cameron Skattebo. I don't know if you saw the highlight of his catch and saving himself from being tackled 2 different times, and he started throwing the ball everywhere, and he gave an incredible sideline speech, although I don't know if Belichick loves those things. He was incredible with a couple of his plays. Looks like he can do a lot, little overlooked, might have wrestled or played lacrosse at some point, but don't be shocked with the 213th selection the New England Patriots take